Okay, so we're going to talk about fats and proteins since we just talked about carbs. So this is what we've got. And so here we go. So fats. Generally in the body, we've got triglycerides. So that's a glycerol molecule and 3 fatty acids. We talked a little bit about this with bioenergetics, how we use the fatty acid chains for energy. So why do we like fat? Well, it tastes good. Like really, that's one of the best things about it, right? It tastes good. Bad thing about fat? Well, it can cause cardiovascular disease, but it doesn't really do it alone. It needs carbs as well. So not going to dive deep into that, but that's one really good thing and one really bad thing. So pros and cons, right? You can always have too much of a good thing. Why do we need fat? What's the importance of it? Well, where to begin? So cell membranes are made up of a phospholipid, so phospho for phosphorus or phosphate, lipid, fat, bilayer. When you're just hanging out watching this video, you're using fats. And the way that we release this energy is hydrogen bonds are broken down. For steroid hormones, okay, those are hormones that can diffuse right through the cell membrane. Estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, those are steroid hormones. Okay, those are important. Fat-soluble vitamins, which we'll get into later this week. It's a great form of insulation. Neurons, myelin is made up of fat. Okay, and so if our neurons have issues, or if you have issues with fat, that could lead to neurological issues. Okay, they're anti-inflammatories, like the omega-3s and the omega-6s help fight infection, or fight inflammatory response, excuse me. So there are lots of different functions for fat. So it's really important, and it's important to remember that not all fat is bad, right? Fat really has a bad reputation that's somewhat warranted, but it's not completely warranted. Okay, if you just completely eliminated fat out of your diet, you're going to be in a world of hurt. Fat is important for athletic performance. Okay, it does delay exhaustion. You have a relatively finite amount of glycogen. Okay, if that is depleted, you can still rely on fat. Now, does it break down as quickly? No, but performance can still continue. So when it comes to exercise, if you're an endurance trained athlete, this endurance training will help you use fat. Okay, depends on the type of fat. We're not going to get super specific into that, but in order to do this, we need to have high fat, free fatty acid concentration. It's not the triglycerides, but it's those free fatty acids. And so we need to figure out, well, how do we increase that in the blood? Okay, so think about that. How can we increase our free fatty acid concentration in our bloodstream? What do you think? So, and we will discuss that in more detail in class, but I want you to kind of think about that, come to class with some potential answers. So what's better for endurance performance? Do we want high fat or high carbs? Now, like we talked about last time, glycogen loading is great. It's beneficial. This is what we use for high-intensity exercise. But if we have a high-fat diet, we're not going to be producing as much glycogen. Okay, so a high-fat diet, if you're eating lots of fat, you're not eating much carbs, then if you have less carbs, you have less glycogen. And as a result, you can't rely on carbs during those high-intensity exercises. So it's likely there's no benefit to aerobic or endurance performance with a high-fat diet. It might taste better, although carbs are pretty tasty as well, but it's not going to necessarily help with that endurance performance. Okay, so then let's talk about proteins. Proteins are just made up of chains of amino acids, which we have talked about. And so remember, there's branched chain amino acids as well. And so there's 20 amino acids that we need, and we classify these as essential and non-essential. And essential amino acids are the ones that we need to consume because our body will not produce them. And 3 of these are these branched chain amino acids. Okay, and these are metabolized in the skeletal muscle, not in the liver. Okay, and so that's kind of some ways that you can think of amino acids. So we've got essential versus non-essential, and then we've got these branched chain amino acids that the big thing is, or one of the big things is where they're metabolized and where we can use them. So why do we need proteins? Well, the cell is made up of protein. There's proteins inside the cell. If you remember back when we were talking about membrane potential in 220. Muscle tissue, they're enzymes. Okay, they can act as a buffer. They're the most important buffer. Okay, osmotic pressure inside your bloodstream. We can use them for energy, but it's arguably one of the least important functions of a protein. Okay, so the recommended daily allowance is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. Now, if you remember with carbs, we had something similar where we said you should base your carbohydrate intake based on your weight. All right, protein is the same way, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the RDA is actually really low. There's some research out there that suggests that almost double or even more is better for you. But the nice thing is, even though the RDA is relatively low, most people take in that much. So how does protein affect performance? Well, if you're an athlete, you're going to need more protein compared to non-athletes. But really, again, going back to how much do you need, it depends on what you do. Okay, so if you're a bodybuilder, you need quite a bit of protein. If you're someone like me that's not a bodybuilder, I'm not going to need as much. Okay, so if I'm doing something that requires strength, I need amino acids in that protein to build muscle tissue. Endurance athletes, I still need protein, but I need it for a different reason. This actually will increase the number of mitochondria, the size of mitochondria that I have, and I can also use it for fuel source as well. So we've talked about if I have too many carbs or more carbs than I'm using, I can convert that to glycogen. If I fill up my glycogen stores, I can convert that to fat. We've talked about if I don't use up my fat, it can be converted to fat tissue, right? Adipose tissue. Well, what happens to protein? Well, we use what we can use. We store tiny bits of it. Some of that we're going to use for energy, but the rest of it we're just going to get rid of. And we do this via urination. So I love a good steak. My favorite cut is New York strip steak, much to the chagrin of some of my friends. Are like, ribeye is where it's at. It's a ribeye or nothing. Either way, $15 a pound, that can be kind of expensive urine. And so you can think about that too with your protein supplements and stuff, that if you're taking in too much, all you're doing is you're making expensive pee. And so with that, we will end on proteins and fats.